Welcome to Historian Diary. Today, I'm going to tell you about a city that became synonymous with an international moral panic. A place where the streets whispered promises of new beginnings, but delivered nightmares. Between 1880 and 1930, Buenos Aires, Argentina, was known throughout Europe by one sinister nickname, the capital of white slavery. And here's what makes this story so complicated. Some of it was real, some of it was exaggerated panic, and all of it was used by different groups with different agendas. Anti-Semites found fuel for their hatred. Reformers found evidence for their crusades. And caught in the middle were thousands of young women, many of them Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, who crossed the Atlantic hoping for a better life and found themselves trapped in a system of exploitation that the Argentine government not only allowed, but profited from. The question that haunts this history: how much was real trafficking and how much was moral panic? The answer is both. And the woman who finally brought down the most powerful prostitution ring in South America paid for her courage with her life at age 34. This is the story of Raquel Lieberman, the Zwi Migdal Society, and the fine line between reality and panic when it comes to trafficking. Subscribe to Historian Diary, because what I'm about to tell you comes from court records, League of Nations reports, newspaper archives, and the testimony of women who survived this system. This isn't mythology. This is documented history that Jewish communities spent decades trying to forget. Let's start with what Buenos Aires was in the late 1800s. Argentina was booming. The country was becoming the world's granary, exporting wheat and beef to Europe. Immigration was exploding. Between 1880 and 1914, over 6 million immigrants poured into Argentina, most settling in Buenos Aires. The city was transforming from a colonial backwater into a cosmopolitan metropolis almost overnight. Railroads, telegraph lines, gas lighting, European architecture. Argentina wanted to be the Paris of South America, but there was a problem. The gender ratio was catastrophically unbalanced. Male immigrants vastly outnumbered female immigrants, sometimes by ratios of 10 to 1. You had hundreds of thousands of men, mostly young, mostly poor, living in a rapidly expanding city with almost no women. And Argentina had a solution that was legal, regulated, and highly profitable: prostitution. In 1875, Buenos Aires passed ordinances regulating brothels as part of a public health campaign. The system was called reglamentarismo. Women who sold sexual favors to more than one man had to register with authorities, undergo bi-weekly medical examinations for venereal diseases, and either live alone or work in licensed houses. The examinations weren't to protect the women. They were to protect male clients. The system treated prostitutes as public health hazards who needed to be monitored, controlled, and contained. By the early 1900s, Buenos Aires had become what historians call a regulated vice hub. Hundreds of legal brothels operated openly. Certain neighborhoods became known for prostitution, identifiable by pink or white translucent curtains instead of traditional lace. The city collected taxes from these establishments. In 1920, according to some estimates, 25% of Buenos Aires' municipal revenue came from brothel taxes. That's not a typo. A quarter of the city's budget was funded by commercialized sex. Subscribe to Historian Diary if you want to understand how governments profit from exploitation. Because this gets darker. Now here's where Europe enters the story. As Buenos Aires was booming, Eastern Europe was collapsing for Jews. The 1881 assassination of Tsar Alexander II triggered waves of pogroms across the Russian Empire. Ashkenazi Jews faced systematic discrimination, excluded from farming, restricted in where they could live, targets of religious persecution. Hundreds of thousands emigrated. Some went to America. Many went to Argentina, which was actively recruiting European immigrants to settle its vast empty territories. By 1914, over 117,000 Jews had immigrated to Argentina, most settling in Buenos Aires. They came desperate, hopeful, and vulnerable. And some people saw opportunity in that desperation. Not just opportunity to help, opportunity to exploit. This is where the Zwi Migdal Society enters our story. Originally called the Varsovia Society, named after Warsaw. This organization was founded by Polish Jewish immigrants in the 1860s. On paper, it was a mutual aid society, the kind of organization immigrant communities create to help newcomers. It had a legal charter. It had official membership. It operated openly in Buenos Aires, but it wasn't what it claimed to be. The Zwi Migdal Society was a prostitution trafficking ring, the most powerful, most organized, most profitable trafficking operation in South America. By 1910, when the first Jewish International Conference on the Suppression of the Traffic in Girls and Women investigated Buenos Aires, they found that of the 42 legal brothels in the city, 39 were owned by Jews connected to this organization. That's 93%. The Zwi Migdal controlled the infrastructure, the supply chain, the political connections, and the enforcement mechanisms of Buenos Aires prostitution. Here's how it worked. Well-dressed men, speaking Yiddish and flaunting their wealth, would return to Eastern European villages on recruitment expeditions funded by the society. They would appear in poor Jewish communities in Poland, Russia, Galicia. They would post advertisements in synagogues, offering jobs for young women in wealthy Jewish households in Argentina. Or they would offer marriage. They would court young women, promise them a better life across the ocean, maybe even go through a Jewish wedding ceremony to make it legitimate. The first documented case one found dates to November 1879. Buenos Aires newspapers announced the arrival of 9 Jewish traffickers, giving their names, ages, and nationalities. Port authorities detained them briefly, but they were released quickly. The Buenos Aires Herald commented sarcastically that they had received carte blanche to pursue their honorable traffic in this country. A few months later, in April 1880, a waiter at the Hotel du Midi reported to police that 8 women were being held prisoner at the hotel by 2 Russian men who were selling them as merchandise. All the women were under 20 years old and had been brought from Galicia, Austria. This was the beginning. By the 1920s, the system had been operating for 40 years. Young women would travel to Buenos Aires, sometimes with a new husband, sometimes with a promised job, almost always believing they were starting a new life. When they arrived at the port, everything changed. There was no job. There was no marriage. There was only a brothel. Comment below. How do you process the fact that governments actively enabled this for tax revenue? Let me give you numbers from the League of Nations. Investigation in 1927. They found that 75% of women working in Buenos Aires brothels were immigrants. Not just immigrants, but recent immigrants. Women who had been in Argentina less than 5 years. Women who didn't speak Spanish. Women who had no family connections, no support networks, no way to navigate the legal system. These were precisely the women the Zwi Migdal targeted, because they were the most vulnerable. Now let's talk about the panic versus the reality. In Europe, particularly in Britain, there was a massive moral panic about white slavery in the 1880s through 1910s. Newspapers ran sensational stories about innocent Christian girls being kidnapped and sold into harems in Buenos Aires. Novels were written. Reform societies were founded. International conferences were held. The term white slavery was used deliberately to invoke the recently abolished African chattel slavery, suggesting this new form of slavery was equally horrific. But here's the complication. Looking back at the evidence, historians now recognize that much of the panic was exaggerated. claims that thousands of English girls were being kidnapped off the streets of London and shipped to Buenos Aires had very little documentation to support them. The stories were often sensationalized, playing on fears of foreign corruption, particularly fears about Jewish criminals preying on Christian women. Argentina, with its large immigrant population and booming economy, became a convenient scapegoat for European countries that wanted to restrict immigration. That Argentine ambassador, Belisario Montero in Brussels, repeatedly protested that his country's moral standing was being unfairly attacked. European critics accused Buenos Aires of being the most open and lucrative market for the sale of women. But Montero argued this was exaggerated propaganda used to justify closing borders to Argentine trade and Argentine immigrants. So was it all a moral panic with no basis in reality? Absolutely not. The trafficking was real. The coercion was real. The exploitation was documented in court records, police reports, and victim testimony. What was exaggerated was the scale and the focus. Most of the trafficking wasn't Christian girls being kidnapped. It was Jewish girls being deceived by Jewish traffickers who exploited religious and cultural connections to gain trust. The Jewish community in Buenos Aires was horrified. This organization, operating under a Jewish Mutual Aid Society name, was destroying the community's reputation. Jewish newspapers in Buenos Aires published condemnations starting in the late 1800s. Jewish organizations banned Zwi Migdal members from synagogues. They refused to allow them to be buried in Jewish cemeteries. They called them Tamim, the impure ones. When the Zwi Migdal tried to present Torah scrolls to synagogues, they were rejected with fury. But here's the painful truth. The Jewish community's attempts to distance themselves from the traffickers sometimes meant distancing themselves from the victims. Women who had been trafficked were stigmatized as prostitutes, even though many had been forced into it through deception, debt bondage, or violence. The community wanted to separate the criminal element from respectable Jews, but in doing so, they sometimes abandoned the women who needed help most. Thank you for watching this far. Comment below. How do communities balance protecting their reputation while helping victims? Now let me tell you about the woman who changed everything. Her name was Raquel Liberman, and she was born Rushla Leah Lieberman in Bereshiv, Ukraine on July 10, 1900. As a child, her family moved to Warsaw. On December 21, 1919, at age 19, she married Yakov Ferber, a tailor, in a Jewish ceremony. Her husband emigrated to Argentina, and in 1922, Raquel followed with their 2 sons. They settled in Tepalk, a small town in Buenos Aires province. Within a year, her husband died of tuberculosis. Raquel was 22 years old, widowed, with 2 small children, in a foreign country where she didn't speak the language. She needed money desperately. She left her children with a foster family and went to Buenos Aires looking for work. This is where historical accounts become unclear. Some sources say she was forced into prostitution. Others suggest she entered voluntarily as one of few options available to a young immigrant widow with no skills and no Spanish. What we know for certain is that she ended up working for a pimp named Jaime Sissinger, paying him for protection, trapped in the Zwi Migdal system for at least 4 years. Raquel worked as a prostitute in Buenos Aires, but she did something remarkable. She saved money. Somehow, possibly with help from someone outside the organization, she managed to hide savings from her captors. Eventually, she saved enough to buy her freedom. She opened an antique shop on Callao Street. For the first time since her husband's death, Raquel Liberman was free. She was running her own business. She was building a life. But the Zwi Migdal wasn't done with her. They couldn't allow her to escape. If other women saw that freedom was possible, the whole system would collapse. So they came for her. First, they raided her shop. Goons sent by the Zui Migdal vandalized her antiques, stole her merchandise, destroyed her inventory. She went to the police in October 1929 to report the theft and recover her goods. Nothing happened. The Zui Migdal had the police in their pocket. Then they set a trap. A man named Jose Salomon Korn approached Raquel and proposed marriage. The wedding took place at a synagogue on Avenida Cordoba. What Raquel didn't know was that the synagogue was actually the central headquarters of the Zui Migdal. And Korn wasn't a merchant. He was one of their pimps. The marriage was a fraudulent scheme to force her back into prostitution. That Raquel asked for help from another Jewish businessman she knew, Simon Brutkiewicz. She didn't know Brutkiewicz was the president of the Zui Migdal. She was completely surrounded by the organization's network, manipulated at every turn. Brutkiewicz offered to return her stolen goods if she would cancel their police complaint and go back to work. She refused. That's when Raquel Liberman did something that changed Argentine history. She contacted Ezra's Noshim, the Society for the Protection of Girls and Women, a Jewish organization founded specifically to fight the Zui Migdal. And through them, she heard about one cop who couldn't be bribed. His name was Julio Alzagare, a federal police commissioner who had been trying for a decade to destroy the Zui Migdal, but couldn't get victims to testify. On New Year's Eve, December 1929, Raquel Liberman walked into Julio Alzagare's office. She gave detailed testimony about how the Zui Migdal operated, the structure, the methods, the names, the locations, the corruption. She knew everything because she had been inside the system. Alzagare took her testimony seriously. The case was assigned to an investigative judge named Manuel Rodriguez Ocampo, another official who refused bribes. In May 1930, police conducted a 10-day raid accompanied by photographers and newspaper reporters. They arrested 300 members of the Zui Migdal. The trial was massive. September 1930, 108 men were convicted. Brothels were closed. Pimps were deported. The Zui Migdal, which had operated for over 60 years, was effectively destroyed in a single trial. All because one woman refused to stay silent. But here's the tragic ending. Raquel Liberman never got to celebrate. She had to hide the fact that she was married and had children because she wanted to protect her sons from retaliation. The Zui Migdal tried to discredit her testimony by producing falsified documents, claiming she continued to work as a prostitute. Some members of the organization were released on appeal. Hundreds fled the country before they could be arrested. In 1934, Raquel applied for a visa to return to Poland. She wanted to go home, but the trip never happened. On April 7, 1935, at 1 p.m., Raquel Liberman died at Ardrick Hospital in Buenos Aires. The cause of death was thyroid cancer. She was 34 years old. Some historians believe the cancer was accelerated by stress. Others wonder if it was really cancer at all, given the Zui Migdal's history of eliminating threats. We'll never know for certain. What we do know is that Raquel Liberman lived just long enough to see the organization that enslaved her fall apart. And then she died, largely forgotten, in the city she had hoped would give her a better life. Subscribe to Historian Diary for more stories of women who changed history at great personal cost. Comment below. Why do we remember the villains but forget the heroes? The aftermath of the Zui Migdal trial reshaped Buenos Aires. In 1935, the city banned brothels entirely. In 1936, a national law, the Law of Social Prophylaxis, outlawed brothels throughout Argentina. Prostitution itself remained legal as private exchange, but the municipal system of regulated brothels that had operated since 1875 was finally ended. The timing wasn't coincidental. In 1930, Argentina experienced a military coup. General Jose Felix Uriburu came to power on a wave of ultra-conservative Catholic nationalism. This government was puritanical, anti-immigration, and deeply anti-Semitic. The Zui Migdal trial gave them perfect ammunition. They could frame the elimination of prostitution as eliminating Jewish corruption. Anti-Semitism surged in Argentina in the 1930s, and the Zui Migdal case was repeatedly cited as evidence of Jewish criminality. This is the painful complexity of this history. Yes, the Zui Migdal was a real criminal organization that trafficked and exploited thousands of women. Yes, it needed to be stopped. But the way it was framed, particularly by nationalist and anti-Semitic forces, turned a story about organized crime into a story about Jewish evil. The vast majority of Buenos Aires' Jewish community had nothing to do with the Zui Migdal. They condemned it. They fought against it. But they were all smeared by association. Let's address the numbers honestly. Jewish women did not represent 90% of prostitutes in Buenos Aires, as some anti-Semitic propaganda claimed. According to verified records, Jewish sex workers made up approximately 22% of the registered prostitutes. That's still disproportionately high given that Jews were only about 3% of Buenos Aires' population. But it's nowhere near the dominant majority that panic narratives suggested. What's true is that within the organized trafficking networks, Jewish traffickers were disproportionately visible. The Zui Migdal controlled 39 of 42 legal brothels by 1910, but thousands of women working in prostitution, Jewish and non-Jewish, were not trafficked. Many were immigrants who chose prostitution as one of few economic options available to them. They weren't deceived or coerced. They made a terrible choice in terrible circumstances. This is where we have to be careful about how we tell this history. The white slavery panic narrative treated all prostitutes as victims who had been kidnapped and forced into slavery. That's not accurate. Many women in the sex trade had agency, made choices, and navigated their circumstances as best they could. But the existence of women who chose prostitution doesn't erase the reality of the women who were trafficked. Both things were true simultaneously. Donagai, in her groundbreaking book, Sex and Danger in Buenos Aires, shows how statistics from municipal prostitution registries were used as evidence for international trafficking. But the numbers were often misrepresented. The fact that 75% of prostitutes were immigrants doesn't automatically mean they were trafficked. Argentina was a nation of immigrants. Almost everyone was an immigrant or the child of immigrants. What the statistics do show is that immigrant women, particularly recent arrivals, were economically vulnerable and more likely to end up in prostitution. Now let me tell you what happened to the women after the Zui Migdal fell. Some managed to leave prostitution. A few opened small businesses. Some married and were absorbed into respectable society. But many were already too old, too sick, or too damaged by years of abuse. They died in poverty in public hospitals. The Jewish benevolent societies that prostitutes had formed for themselves, because mainstream Jewish institutions excluded them, eventually disbanded as their members died. Their cemetery plots were sometimes purchased by respectable Jewish organizations, and a few of the women were quietly accepted into Jewish rest homes for the elderly. But many died alone, forgotten, their stories erased. The descendants of Zui Migdal prostitutes are today living comfortable, prominent lives in Buenos Aires, according to historian Abraham Lichtendahl. But most families don't talk about where their wealth originated. The history of the Zui Migdal remained deliberately obscured for decades because it was too shameful, too complicated, too useful for anti-Semite. It wasn't until the late 20th century that scholars like Donagai, Edward Bristow, and Jewish Women's Archive researchers began seriously documenting this history. Novels, plays, and documentaries have since told Raquel Liberman's story. In September 2020, Buenos Aires installed a memorial tile with her name on the street where she worked. A subway station was named in her honor. She's finally getting recognition as a symbol of feminist resistance. 85 years after her death. Thank you for watching Historian Diary. This is uncomfortable history. History that shows how moral panic and real trafficking can exist simultaneously. How anti-Semitism exploits real crimes to smear entire communities. How governments profit from exploitation while claiming to protect public morals. How one woman's courage can bring down a powerful criminal network. Even if she doesn't live to see the full impact. Here's what we can say definitively about the white slavery panic in Buenos Aires. There was real trafficking. The Zui Migdal Society operated for over 60 years, deceiving thousands of young Jewish women with false promises of marriage or employment, then forcing them into prostitution through debt bondage, violence, and manipulation. The organization controlled most of Buenos Aires' legal brothel system and had international operations spanning continents. This was not exaggerated. This was documented in court records, victim testimony, and police investigations. But the panic was also real. European newspapers sensationalized the threat, playing on xenophobia and anti-Semitism. They focused on imagined Christian victims while ignoring the real Jewish victims. They portrayed Buenos Aires as a hellscape of kidnapped innocents when the reality was more complicated. A city where prostitution was legal, regulated, and profitable. Where some women were trafficked, some chose sex work, and all were stigmatized. The lesson isn't that we should dismiss trafficking concerns, because some panic narratives were exaggerated. The lesson is that panic often obscures rather than illuminates. When we panic about trafficking, we tend to create simplistic victim narratives that don't match reality. We focus on perfect victims, innocent virgins stolen from their families. When real trafficking victims are messy, complicated people who made choices in impossible situations. Raquel Lieberman wasn't a perfect victim. She had worked in prostitution for years before escaping. She had navigated the system, survived it, even saved money within it. That didn't make her any less worthy of justice. That didn't make the Zui Migdal any less criminal. But it means we have to tell her story honestly, without sanitizing it into a melodrama. The white slavery panic era teaches us to be skeptical of moral panics while still taking trafficking seriously. It teaches us that communities facing discrimination will sometimes police their own members brutally to avoid collective blame. It teaches us that governments will regulate and profit from exploitation while publicly condemning it. And it teaches us that sometimes justice requires one person willing to testify despite threats, despite isolation, despite knowing they might not survive to see change. Raquel Lieberman was that person. She walked into a police office on New Year's Eve 1929 and destroyed the most powerful prostitution ring in South America. She died 5 years later at 34, largely unknown. Now, almost a century later, her name is finally being remembered. Not as a prostitute, not as a victim, but as the woman who refused to stay silent. See you next time on Historian Diary.